you could read this.
Oh, this is an enthusiastic supporter of Tom Paine in the 1790s called Citizen Randolph, who wrote a pamphlet that said, "Oh, Paine, next to God, how infinitely are millions beholden to you for this small remnant of their liberties. Caesars, Ferdinands and Tsarinas have fought ferociously to enslave mankind. But it was reserved to you to wave celestial banners on the rights of man over the tottering bastilles of Europe, to break the shackles of a despotism from the ankles of millions, and destroy those yokes of oppression for the necks of millions more as yet unborn."
Is that the kind of response that he got in his time? It's an extraordinary quotation.
That is more high-blown language than commonly found among his supporters, but it has a tremendous range of social class and distribution, his support. I mean, at the other extreme, you can find an anonymous letter which was written by some grumpy person in the Isle of Wight and addressed to a very conservative, very reactionary clergyman, which is signed at the end, "We ham for the rights of man, for the rights of Tom Paine, you bugger." So that, I mean, that's a different kind of language. The enthusiasm was especially for Rights of Man Part 2, which had a whole set of very straightforward social proposals for redistributing wealth, providing old age pensions, providing pensions for the sick, a sort of welfare state model. And this was produced in very cheap editions and had an immense sale. And reading groups were formed in cities like Sheffield, where artisans met together and discussed this section by section. So it was an educational experience for them.
Could many people read in those days? How was his ideas disseminated?
Well, more people could read than one thinks, yeah. And it was possible, of course, also to read passages of this aloud. I mean, that's one of the functions of the reading group, of the discussion group, but this could be read, and as it could be read sometimes in the workshop. If it was a workshop whose process was quiet, you could have a reader, as you did in other countries too. In the early days of the labour movement, the American cigar workers always sort of appointed and paid a reader for them, so that this was a fairly universal practice.
Do you have actual evidence that Rights of Man was disseminated among working people? I mean, do you have...
Oh yes, one does, yes. In a curious way, the government and ruling class inspired campaign against Tom Paine with Tom Paine burnings. Tom Paine was probably burnt more in effigy than anyone except Guy Fawkes. And all that served to advertise Paine's Rights of Man. I mean, if it was important enough to burn him, let's find out what he's saying. And one comment from Herefordshire in the West Country was that there'd been these Tom Paine burnings, so now there was scarce an old woman anywhere in the county but who was saying, "Who is Tom Paine? What does Tom Paine say?" So that this advertisement was made, and for a brief period it was immensely, sensationally popular and also controverted, also controversial issue.
What was, when we read it today, his proposal seems so mild and so frightening to the powers that be.
Well, Tom Paine is always a bit of a puzzle. He did it more than once. He wrote out in plain, very clear language what people probably had thought already, but had never found expressed before. I mean, he did this in America with common sense. I mean, people were thinking of separating from England, but no one had written about the question so bluntly as Tom Paine did. And with the rights of man, he said, I wondered how something written in a style unusual, unfamiliar to English people would be received. And this question of style is more than style, it's what nowadays it's fashionable to call discourse. The discourse of the 18th century was framed entirely within constitutional premises. That is, if you were a reformer, you had to find a constitutional historical precedent to justify your reform. This was usually the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688, or it might go further back. I mean, some radical reformers even went back to Saxon times and King Alfred and dredged up most unlikely precedents, you know, that they produced a picture of Anglo-Saxon England in which the people were in continual session in folk motes, deciding almost, you know, almost as a consensual hobby, their policy. Well, what Paine did is he moved right out of this constitutional framework. He said things which were blasphemous, really, in terms of the British discourse, which, as I say, the radicals had shared. He said that we had no constitution, the English had no constitution. That was absolutely blasphemous to say. He said, a Norman bastard with an armed banditti. Well, I can't remember the exact words he used, but he raided the country, and that made a rascally precedent for anything. I mean, that William the Conqueror had no precedent of right at all. So he argued his case purely in terms of rational need and a rational advantage for society, and dismissed contemptuously monarchy, House of Lords, peers, privilege of all kinds, in a way which not only seemed blasphemous, but was, in the sense that it was actually illegal. You know, you were not allowed to say that there was no constitution. You were not allowed to oppose monarchy in that kind of way, although obviously a lot of people in their secret thoughts did. And when the rights of man was brought to trial, this was really the issue. And of course, the court found him guilty. And that did create problems for reformers in England, because it meant that if they used certain kinds of language, Tom Paine's kind of language, they were liable to couple of years imprisonment. And imprisonment in those days was imprisonment. I mean, it was in such insanitary conditions, such disease-infested places, that you were lucky to come out alive. It wasn't a question whether it was 1 year or 5. It's just the exposure to these kinds of conditions.
Talk a bit about Carlyle in this context. Carlyle publishing Paine.
Yes, well, when This led at first to withdrawal by the reformers from Paine's Rights of Man a bit, from its language, although they secretly, or quietly, privately supported it still. And then you had Paine supporters up and down the country who had illegal copies of the Rights of Man, under-the-counter stuff, and were very ardent in support and were centres of discussion right into the next century. And early in the next century you have the attempt to break the ban by simply going ahead and publishing Paine's work. And this is what a man called Richard Carlile did, who was a free thinker. He was probably more interested in Tom Paine's Age of Reason than he was in The Rights of Man. But he was indomitable and very courageous. And he simply went on and on and on publishing, and he had shops, bookshop, where you didn't actually see the person who sold you the copy. It came through a hole in the back of the shop, so that there couldn't be a prosecution of someone for selling the copy. And he had volunteers who came from all parts to help him sell these things, including his wife and his sister, and some of them served terms of imprisonment as well.
So, as specifically as you can, when the Rights of Man was published, what did the government do?
The government's reaction was very sharp to the publication of the Rights of Man, but it was aided by quasi-private initiatives, the most important of which was the initiative of a man called John Reeve, who formed an association for the preservation of liberty and property against republicans and levellers. And this was able to you could call it a kind of controlled mob action against prominent reformers in provincial towns who would find themselves with their windows broken and sometimes besieged by hostile crowds, and prosecutions for anyone selling anything of Paine's or with that kind of language, and above all organized bonfires and effigy burnings, which is an old kind of vocabulary of... They employed this vocabulary. It was a popular vocabulary, but they employed it themselves. And you have evidence that local bigwigs and local solicitors and people like that were actually paying their toadies to organize these. And they were ferocious affairs at times. I mean, you had Tom Paine in effigy taken in a cart like a condemned criminal to the gallows through the centre of the village or the town, and then sometimes shot, and sometimes, I mean, it would be an effigy that would be shot, or burned in a great Guy Fawkes type bonfire, or hacked to pieces. You know, this was an event which commanded a lot of interest amongst the populace. I don't think it convinced them of anything. I think it advertised, as I've said.
Did they attack Paine, what's the Latin term, ad hominem, as a person to... They couldn't deal with his ideas. Did they try to attack him as a person?
The attack on Paine as a person tended to be rather later. I mean, there was a ferocious response to the Age of Reason, which was, although Paine maintained that he was a deist, it was seen as an atheist tract, partly because its language was so blunt. I mean, he used very simple and straightforward language, like he said, we are told that Christ was born of a virgin 1700 years ago. Were any country girl today to tell us that she was with child, and she was got with child by a ghost, and that an angel told her so, we would know what to think of it. And that sort of language was quite shocking to people. And indeed may be shocking to people still. And it created some dissension among the Paine enthusiasts, because some of them, I think particularly the case of Norwich, were nonconformists, were perhaps Baptists, or in some cases irregular Methodists, and they had to choose between religious beliefs and Paine. And it was as a sword sent to divide. Now, after the Age of Reason, the personal attack on Paine became more pointed. There had already been a bogus biography of Paine, which was scurrilous and was supported by government money. And they concentrated on Paine's alleged drinking, about which I can't give a verdict. I mean, I think he did drink sometimes, but I don't think he was the drunkard that they wanted to portray him. And also upon his supposed general immorality of conduct. And this, of course, followed him to the United States. When he returned from France to the United States at the end of the century, there was a good deal of hostility to him for this kind of reason.
So the black lie stuck in a way.
Oh yes, that's right, yes. Black lies did stick, yes.
Sounds very modern. It sounds modern. What were they so afraid of? What was everyone so afraid of?
Well, I think we don't have to ask that so much today as we might have in our simplicity 20 years ago. But we now, I think, understand that a society is controlled more by discourse and conventional belief than it is by force. I mean, the collapse of communism in the last few years is partly just total collapse of the ideology and belief system and discourse limitations of the society. And I think in that sense that if you threaten certain sensitive points in this belief system, you are actually threatening the power of the ruling orders. It's true of that time. I think they had reason to be concerned, because it was an extremely, totally unrepresented and pretty corrupt form of government in the country at the time. And people knew this and had ways of pointing at particular corruptions, but to dismiss the entire England's ancient constitution, mixed of interchecking powers, king, lords and commons, to dismiss all that as a fable was heresy.
Paine, I'm just jumping around, but Paine writes of the Age of Reason for a specific political end as well as he wasn't just talking about religion. Maybe you could talk about that a bit, because it's a little puzzling to me. How does this connect with his overall ideology?
Yeah, Paine, who always found a simple way of sort of getting out of difficulties, simply said, my religion is to do good and the world is my country. A beautiful thing to say, but it was allied to I'm a great admirer of Paine. I mean, I think he remains a profound influence, but he was in some senses shallow and over-optimistic. I mean, he said he couldn't believe that monarchy would survive for more than 20 years in any enlightened country, and that doesn't seem to have turned out true. He also had a supreme faith that if you only abolished privilege, everyone would agree perfectly with each other, you know, there would be no more problems. And I suppose in that sense, the Age of Reason was advancing his political view of ethics, and was an intervention partly influenced by the French situation. He actually wrote it in France when he was in prison and could have come under the guillotine. Or I think he'd written some of it before.
I just want to go back to something you said before. He was very much, if there's a consistency in his life, it's this attack on aristocracy, this attack on privilege, the idea of no deference. Maybe talk a bit about that aspect of it.
Well, it's not just that Paine was hostile to any form of privilege, but the tone, the assured, combative tone in which he developed his argument, that was both impressive and shocking. When he said, and he demanded, what are all these lords paid for? We have lords of this and lords of that, lords of the necessary house, and they are all paid, you know, from taxes, and what do they ever do which is of value to the public? And the frankness and the sharpness of his challenge. I mean, anyone who picks up The Age of Reason today, or his some of his shorter pieces of, for example, his address when he was being tried in absentia, very pugnacious piece of writing. We'll see this. I think they will see this. That it is the tone, as much as what is said, but the tone, the way in which it's said, which I think was shocking.
Change from Spain. Market?
This is 5